The rain had been falling for 90 hours straight, not the cleansing downpour of a summer storm, but a monotonous, soul-dampening drizzle that turned the clay soil into a clinging, existential threat. Elias, tucked into the hollow remains of what had once been a pharmacy, smelled perpetually of mildew, cold sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of unspent fear. He was 18, though the lack of sun and sleep had aged his eyes by decades. His patrol had been pinned down in this forgotten urban graveyard for 3 days, waiting for a relief that smelled suspiciously like a retreat. The real enemy wasn't the distant mortar fire, which was predictable and impersonal. The real enemy was the silence between the mortar bursts, the heavy, crushing quiet that forced him to listen to the frantic, erratic beat of his own heart. He was staring at the shattered street corner, where a lone, brown plastic flower pot lay on its side, a pointless testament to normalcy, when the sound cut through the drizzle. It was soft, almost too fragile to survive the damp air, and initially, he dismissed it as a dying radio battery or static interference. But then it resolved itself. It was music, not martial drums or shouting propaganda, but a melody. It was faint, tinny, and slightly warped, the sound of a scratched vinyl record being played somewhere far beyond the established demarcation line, maybe 300 meters across the skeletal, shell-pocked plaza. Elias froze, every muscle in his neck tightening. Music was forbidden on both sides of this specific sector, an unspoken rule born of paranoia and the fear of revealing position. This wasn't carelessness. This was defiance, or perhaps desperation. He listened harder, tilting his head just slightly, ignoring the cold trickling down his collar. The tune was slow, measured, played on something that sounded like a cheap, small acoustic guitar, the strings slightly flat. It was a melody utterly devoid of ideology or anger, a rhythm that spoke only of weariness and distance, a sound so unexpectedly human that it felt like a trespass against the very nature of war he had been taught to accept. He lowered the rifle barrel just enough so the sight didn't obscure his vision, his fingers cold and stiff on the trigger guard. He grabbed the spotting scope, its rubber eyepiece icy against his brow, and slowly scanned the ruins opposite. The source of the sound had to be the derelict clockmaker's shop or the skeletal remains of the municipal library, two key positions the enemy held, both bombed-out shells offering minimal cover but maximum visibility. The melody continued, a simple ABA structure that repeated with minor variations, like someone learning a difficult passage or finding comfort in repetition. Through the scope, the world flattened and magnified. He tracked along the high street, past the overturned tram car, past the blackened facades where ghost windows stared back blankly. Finally, resting against the crumbling concrete of the library's former entrance arch, he saw him, not a charging soldier, not a helmeted head peering over sandbags, but a man, barely visible in the gloom, slouched low, his uniform indistinguishable from the gray rubble around him. He wasn't playing the music himself. He was leaning back, shoulders slumped, and had clearly set up a small, battery-operated record player on a piece of debris beside him. The soldier was facing away from Elias, looking towards the south, towards the imagined edge of the conflict, perhaps towards his own home. He wasn't guarding, he wasn't eating, he was simply listening, motionless except for the occasional lift of his hand to wipe something from his face. Rain or fatigue, Elias couldn't tell. The scope settled, focusing sharply on the soldier's exposed wrist, where the cuff of his jacket was pulled back slightly. The man wore a silver watch, its bezel scraped and dull, a detail so mundane, so unconnected to the mythos of the brutal, faceless enemy, that it struck Elias with disproportionate force. He realized that this man, who was meant to embody the absolute darkness they were fighting, probably woke up to an alarm, probably had to check the time before patrol just like Elias. The simple, mournful guitar music was now a soundtrack to an impossible stillness, a moment where the lines of conflict evaporated, leaving only two young men separated by a valley of mutual exhaustion. As the faint, tinny melody cycled again, something shifted in Elias's gut, a cold, sickening lurch that had nothing to do with hunger or fear of the approaching night. The tune, it wasn't just a generic folk song. It wasn't military music designed to demoralize or inspire. It was the exact melody. A shiver, colder than the rain, tracked down his spine. The piece, simple and repetitive as it was the lullaby his mother had hummed to him when he was 5, confined to bed with a persistent fever. It wasn't a popular chart hit. It was an obscure, regional piece from the deep farmlands of their own country, a melody linked intrinsically to the smell of drying lavender and the dusty light filtering through his grandmother's kitchen window. How could this be? How could a soldier, supposedly from the opposing regime, hundreds of miles from Elias's pastoral upbringing, be listening to that specific, deeply personal piece of music? The implications were catastrophic to his worldview. They had been told these people were aliens, ideological zealots, culturally removed barbarians whose only goal was destruction. Yet, there, leaning against the gray stone, was a man whose deepest comfort seemed to align precisely with Elias's own most sacred private memory. It shattered the neatly constructed propaganda barrier that had protected Elias's sanity since he crossed the line. If their lullabies were the same, what else did they share? The exhaustion, the crippling homesickness, the gnawing doubt? He clutched the scope, the plastic digging into his palm, unable to pull away from the image of the slumped figure listening to the melody that defined Elias's lost innocence. This moment, suspended between two heartbeats in the ceaseless war, felt like the purest truth he had encountered since deployment. It compels one to wonder. In conflicts fought over abstract ideologies and distant flags, when you finally look across the razor wire and see a reflection of your own quiet suffering, who then, truly, is the enemy you are fighting? Share your thoughts on this complex moral realization in the comments below. Do you believe proximity to shared humanity can ever truly trump the instilled duties of war? The melody finally ended. The sudden silence was jarring, heavier than the ceaseless drone of the rain had been. Elias watched the figure opposite. The soldier reached down, presumably turning off the tiny record player, and then, for the first time, moved with real intention. He shifted his weight, winced slightly, and then raised a gloved hand to his mouth. The sound that followed was unmistakable, raw, and utterly human. A deep, ragged, chest-rattling cough, the kind that spoke of damp conditions, lack of medical care, and deep systemic exhaustion. It echoed slightly in the vast, empty plaza, a testament to shared misery that required no translation. Elias himself had been fighting a similar persistent cold for weeks. The cough was followed by a long, slow sigh, which, even across the distance and the distortion of the scope, sounded like the pure articulation of relief and profound loneliness. The soldier remained motionless for several minutes, merely staring south. Elias imagined what he saw in that direction. A small apartment, perhaps, or a dirt road leading to a village. He saw a wife, maybe, or a mother who worried about the persistent cough and the smell of gunpowder. He wasn't seeing the political schematic of the opposing regime. He was seeing a man whose simple act of seeking solace through a shared, quiet piece of music had accidentally exposed the great, terrible lie of the war, that the people on the other side were inherently different. Elias felt a sudden, violent impulse to stand up, to yell across the rain-swept valley, not a threat or a challenge, but simply the name of the song, to acknowledge the shared memory. But the impulse died in the stale air of the ruined pharmacy. He was a soldier bound by duty and silence, and the smallest deviation could mean instant violent death for him or for the man who now knew in some distant subconscious way that he was being watched, monitored, cataloged as a target. The vulnerability was dangerous, a weakness that the cold, impersonal machinery of war could not tolerate. The man eventually gathered his things, slipping the record player into a drab military pack. He stood up slowly, favoring his right knee, another small detail that cemented his reality. He was injured or just tired or both. He looked once, briefly, toward Elias's general direction, not with recognition, but with the weary, blank look of a person enduring an endless wait. Then he disappeared into the shadow of the library ruins. The plaza returned to its original silence, broken only by the persistent, soft drumming of the rain on broken glass and concrete. But the quiet was fundamentally altered. It was no longer the oppressive silence of unspent tension. It was the heavy quiet of profound, personal grief. Elias finally lowered the scope, his arms shaking not from exertion, but from the sudden, chilling clarity of his realization. The enemy was not the man with the silver watch and the shared folk music. The enemy was the architects of the fear, the people who drew the lines on the maps, who supplied the uniforms and the rifles, and who convinced two 18-year-old boys that they were fundamentally different because of the shade of their operational flag. Elias spent the rest of his watch not watching for movement, but listening for the phantom strain of the lullaby, knowing that the man on the other side carried the same scars, the same homesickness, and the same terrifying secret. They were all just cold children, forced to wait for death in a ruined town, separated by nothing but the manufactured conviction of difference. He had come to war believing in the purity of his cause. He would leave the valley knowing that his true fight was against the indifference of those who sent him here. If this quiet, introspective story about the shared human cost of conflict touched your heart, please subscribe to Quiet Soldier Stories and join us again for another glimpse into the silent battles fought within the hearts of soldiers.